So I wrote a book called The 100-Year Life, which is about how, if we've got this extra time, what do we do with it? Joe Coughlin says, we turn this into a negative story, how do we afford social security? Isn't there something a bit more imaginative we can ask ourselves? If we're living another 30 years, what do we want to do with those 30 years? And Laura Carstensen spoke eloquently last year about a new map of life. And she hosted a meeting at Stanford in California where they were investigating what this could be, what uses could we make of time, and it's a major project that Laura is doing. And we said, well, why don't we get together and think about whether there's a global longevity agenda? And I'm going to kind of give my riff on the global longevity agenda as a macroeconomist, because again, I got into this topic because I kept reading about an aging society, which just said there's more old people. But if how we're aging is changing, if we're redesigning the map of life, there's a longevity dividend to be seen. And so can we sort of, there's the sort of the economic challenges of an aging society, and there's economic opportunities of a longevity dividend. And could we start to think about that as a narrative around the world? Because every country is aging, every country is seeing an increase in the proportion of people aged 65. But the question that's come up at lots of time today is sort of, oh, this is just a rich country problem or a rich person's problem. So we wanted to try and investigate whether that was true or not. So the Rockefeller Foundation very kindly sponsored us and enabled us to use their Bellagio Center. And you can see in the background the Bellagio Center. In all my readings around longevity, may I tell you that probably the best thing to do to augment your longevity is to live on the shores of Lake Como. It really is a fantastic place. I think that's George Clooney's place around the corner you can see or something. But anyway, we had, as you can see, they said it's a great location for a conference, and it really was. It's slightly monastic, but you'll sort of spend your time together talking about these issues. And we also very gratefully received sponsorship from Prudential Singapore, more of them in a minute. But this is the aging society story. Around the world, we're seeing an increase in the average age of society. And this comes back all the time to that demographic structure point. Demographers have sort of captured the aging society story, whereas I think the message today is actually there's a lot more than demographics at work. But if you look at the demographic transition, there's a fall in the birth rate, there's more people living older, so younger cohorts are smaller, older cohorts are larger, and the average age of society is increasing. And it's increasing everywhere. So everywhere's got an aging society, but of course that demographic transition is very closely related to income growth. So the richest countries have gone through the demographic transition, and they've got the highest age, but everyone else is too, is going to follow in their track. But they're just sort of behind at a different stage. So everyone knows they've got an aging society, and the speed at which your economic growth determines how quickly you go through it. But again, like I sort of showed you earlier with those UK demographic pyramids, there's another way of looking at this, which is life expectancy. And around the world, life expectancy is increasing. Now, of course, there's different reasons why life expectancy is increasing. In low-income countries, it's about dramatic improvements in infant mortality that the rich countries did 100 years ago. In middle-income countries, it's improvements in middle-age mortality rates that the rich countries went through 30, 40 years ago. And of course, the rich countries are pushing life expectancy up by seeing reductions in mortality at 70, 80, and 90 years of age. But remember I said there's an aging society which is purely about the composition of the population, but then there's longevity. Everyone born today has to think about having more time ahead of them. And you can see from this chart that is a global agenda. Only if you think about aging and end of life and sort of going past 80, do you say this is just a rich country problem. Around the world, every country has to think about a new map of life. Obviously, thinking about a map of life that goes from 30 to 50 years is different from one that goes from 80 to 100. But it still is, every country has to think about how they ensure that everyone makes better use of this future, how they provide the resources to structure a different life. So that's kind of what we were focusing about. And, it's clear that when you talk to someone who's dealing with, low-income groups in South Africa, that the challenges around longevity are very different from when you talk to someone who's coming from California. It was also a very interesting meeting because we had economists, we had educators, we had health specialists, we had gerontologists, we had pediatricians. It may just be our small sample, but gerontologists and pediatricians don't tend to get on very well with one another. They're obviously sort of looking at different points of life. But of course, this whole longevity stuff does start, as we've heard, right at the very beginning, even perhaps before the beginning. So anyway, the conversation was, is there a global longevity agenda? Is this something we can start to promulgate with international institutions so we get away from just the aging society story? And if there is a longevity agenda, what is common across countries? What are the principles of longevity? And what are the actions that we would like governments to take? So this is the beginning of a dialogue. We had 5 days, so it's a big topic. You think we talked about a lot today, but of course, it's just, well, we're living to 100 years, because that amount of time we might eventually get around to dealing with some of the issues. But here are sort of some of the principles that were kicked around the room. There'll be more coming out later in a more concise form. But the first we've heard time and time again is we need to celebrate this. We need to start changing the narrative. If on average, in every country around the world, people are living longer and they're healthier for longer, that just seems worth saying out loud and celebrating, because if we're trying to get the public engaged in this topic, let's start with that. Okay? The second thing is that, if it is about time, let's think about how we can improve the allocation of time across the lifetime. Most people at any point in time say, I'm really pressed for time. I've got relationships I need to maintain, I've got children to look after, parents to look after, jobs to look after. Can we think about how we shift those time burdens if we got more time? And that's about reinventing the stages of life. We've talked a lot about some of these things already, avoiding a dependence on chronological age. The reason why economists talk negatively about this is they measure age chronologically. And of course, chronological age is not malleable. 1 year every year is always the same. But biological and sociological age are. But if there's these two channels, more old people and how we're aging is changing, if we focus on chronological measures of age, we're going to miss that completely. The other thing I think is important about longevity is about the whole life course. And of course, if these life expectancy statistics carry on increasing, that's particularly an issue for the young. And so it builds in intergenerational issues straight away. So ensuring that the changes are intergenerationally fair, because the other challenge with the old age dependency ratio is you have the young, the middle-aged, and the old, and you kind of forget that actually you go from being young to being middle-aged to being old. This notion of a conflict between the two is extraordinary. Even the old age dependency ratio, which says the old are dependent upon those who are working, well, 30 years earlier, the old were the working people, and the working people were the children, and the children were dependent on the middle-aged people. So we need to think about this in an intergenerational way. So these are some of the themes that we were talking about. The interesting thing is, can we start and think about a longevity agenda in different countries? The UK has set up a UK Longevity Council. We have Andy Briggs coming along later to tell us about that and the agenda in the UK. I think that's a fantastic move. Linda was talking about designing a 100-year life. That's actually also the name of a commission the Japanese Prime Minister set up. How do we design a 100-year life? So can we start thinking about a longevity agenda as well as an aging society agenda? Can we use some of these principles we discussed at Bellagio to think about analysing a country? So on Monday and Tuesday this week I was in Singapore, where we talked about the global longevity agenda. And of course, Singapore is interesting for the reasons we'll see. That's life expectancy at birth in Singapore, and it's rising at an incredibly steady 3 years every 10 years. And unlike UK life expectancy, shows no signs yet of slowing down. So if you just simple-mindedly extrapolate that trend, children in Singapore to being born today in Singapore have a very plausible chance of living to 100. So Singapore has one of the highest life expectancies in the world, and it's very, very good. But why would you call that a problem? Particularly, by the way, as most of those years are healthy. What's staggering about Singapore is, given how rapidly it's grown, its population structure is changing very dramatically. So you remember the demographic pyramids I showed at the beginning of the day? Well, these are the same things for Singapore over a longer period of time, but it is staggering. The average Singaporean female will give birth to 1.2 children. Averages are strange things, yeah? 1.2 is an odd number. I always say to my students, if you've got one hand in a pot of boiling water and one hand in the freezer, on average, you're doing fine. So, averages can be very misleading, but 1.2 child born per Singaporean female. That's very different from the UK. So the birth rate has fallen dramatically over 60 years, and so there's not many young. Singapore's got this fantastic increase in life expectancy, most of which is healthy life expectancy. It's got a very high ratio of healthy life expectancy to life expectancy. And that gives you that extraordinary, it's not a demographic pyramid, is it? It's like a demographic urn or something. I don't know what you would call it, that bottom right. And Singapore has seen one of the fastest increases in life expectancies and one of the fastest agings of society. Now, what's interesting, Japan looks a bit like this as well. Now, one of the things I often hear is, oh, Japan's a model of what the US and the UK are going to go through. It's not, because there's two things at work. There's a change in the age structure of the population, and how we're aging is changing. Now, Singapore and Japan are brilliant at improving the malleability of age. They're aging very well. Unfortunately, their birth rate has fallen so sharply, they've got this massive increase in the number of old people. So they have a challenge that the UK and US does not have. We've got to get better at the age malleability, but we don't have this dramatic restructuring. Now, I think that's interesting because for me, there's these two channels, changing the age structure of the population and changing how we age. It means the UK and the US has kind of got an easier job of things because the age structure is not working against it so much. And so it's going to have an easier job of getting the benefits of it. Of course, the flip side is in China and Singapore and Japan, they've massively got to invest in age malleability. They've got to focus on the young today and make sure they age brilliantly so they can be healthy and productive for as long as possible. But of course, the agenda in Singapore is mostly about an aging society. So we went through some of the sort of principles of the global longevity agenda, and forgive me, this is a really sort of simple summary of kind of out of three how Singapore is doing on these things. Singapore is doing brilliantly on promoting a longevity agenda. 2/3 of Singaporeans want to work more over 65. Singapore is quite a unique country. I'm not sure, say, France would give quite the same answer as that. But 2/3 of Singaporeans like their job and want to carry on working. And the participation rate, the employment rate for people aged over 65 is the highest in the world in Singapore. And the way they do that is they pushed up retirement date. They've also introduced flexible working after retirement, flexible working with a lower pay, but most people want to work flexibly and are prepared to take a pay discount for that. They're also doing lots of stuff on lifelong learning, lots of stuff on preventable health. And they're also, free is perhaps a bit generous, but you want to be nice to Singaporeans. They're also doing quite a lot of intergenerational schemes. So extraordinary is a character called John Wong, who is incredibly impressive. And Linda knows John because he's involved in the Global Challenge Initiative. Really, he's got 1/3 of Singapore to work with, and he's focusing on health and building and activity and work to try and integrate healthy aging into every aspect of Singaporean society. However, if you then start going through, so new technology, Singapore is investing in some of the scientific stuff that we were talking about earlier this morning, the sort of R&D side of life sciences. It's got a challenge, as I think someone else mentioned, it's a small country. So scale-wise, it does need the US to sort of do things. It can do some things, but it's going to have to rely upon other countries with their scale. New narrative is interesting because Singapore is extraordinary what they've done. In 50, 60 years, they've increased life expectancy by 30. 26 years of that is healthy life expectancy. But it's not really celebrated. It's like, we've got a problem. So trying to change the narrative about promoting something that says, this is a great opportunity, what we do with it. And one of the things I learned from the 100-year life was actually people are quite hungry for that. I think people are realizing that this aging society story is not playing out exactly as we thought. Because aging is diverse, and there are all the challenges of dementia and social care that we know so well and we fear so well. But of course, the propensity to get dementia is actually declining. It's just there's more old people, so the number of people with dementia is increasing. But there's also this positive agenda that needs to be seized and articulated. Then the other challenges, I think, where Singapore was not so strong was the all of life. They're really addressing this as about aging society. And I say, that to me, the key thing about the life course approach is recognizing the recursivity of life. What happens now affects what happens in the next stage of life, which then influences what happens in the next stage of life. And so, as has been said repeatedly today, it doesn't matter when you start, you can affect how you age, but it's really good to start quite early. And I think thinking about the life course so that actually we start thinking about the young and how they can think about living successfully over this length of time is incredibly important. And of course, understandably in Singapore, where there's so many old people, it's seen as being an aging society. But sort of, I think Fran Lebowitz said she used to think when she was young that old people were a different ethnic group. There's a connection between you young and you young old, and trying to make sure one thinks about that, I think, is important. Then the other challenge, which sort of worries me, and I obviously wrote about it in the 100-year life, is that we invented a 3-stage life of education, work, retirement for a lifespan of 70, but if Singaporeans are living to 100, stretching it out doesn't seem right. And it's great to have lifelong learning, but if you're working as hard as Singaporeans do every week and every month, that's going to take quite a toll. And someone in the previous panel sent in a question about sort of flexible working and 4-day working week. You know, one of the ways I think we will see with rising productivity from AI and robotics is perhaps a shorter working week and a more flexible working week. We've got a technology that can raise our productivity and a technology that can deal with moving parts more easily. But focusing on that, I think, is going to be a big challenge. And of course, whenever you talk to anyone in Singapore about perhaps taking a bit of time off in middle age, that kind of just doesn't compute. It's just not the Singaporean way. So I think, you know, there are these big social custom problems. I said at the beginning of the day, I think sometimes it'll be easier to crack the sort of biological challenges about aging we talked about this morning than trying to overcome some of the social norms about how we see age, how we think about being old, and what we actually need to do. I always give the example of teenagers, which were invented in the 20th century. I think it took about 50, 60 years to work out what to do with teenagers. And they kind of figured it out eventually. Oh, that's what it is. But the first reaction was not James Dean. It was things like the Boys Brigade and the Boy Scouts. Stick him in a uniform, give him some discipline. And that didn't really work. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this social experiment. There's going to be a combination of top-down and bottom-up that needs to work. But it's a long, long process that needs to be done. And then the other thing is there's an inevitable tendency to think about chronological age. And again, I think this is a really big challenge because we can simplify increasing life expectancy by saying let's raise the retirement age. So Denmark, 62, Singapore is now 67. But if people age diversely, a single number, 67, just doesn't work. And so we have to account for that diversity. And so too much reliance upon chronological age and how we think about retirement is going to miss the really complicated thing about age malleability. Perhaps when we make the progress that everyone's aging well, we can revert to chronological age. But right now, as we've seen with the inequality and the malleability, we're not optimizing that malleability. So reliance upon chronological age is actually very challenging. So that was the reaction in Singapore. It's been very interesting seeing the press response, which has been fantastic. You know, people are getting more and more engaged in this topic. Around the world, everyone's aging. And one of the phrases I really don't like is often used for Vietnam or China about countries getting old before they're rich and how that gives them a real burden. And I kind of, again, think it kind of misses the point because the earlier you start with these challenges, the better. So we know what's happening in China. We know what's happening in the Middle East. We know what's happening in Africa. Life expectancy is increasing. The population may be average age of 25, but they're going to live longer than the previous generation. And actually, it is really important to put in place now the pathways that will help, given the circumstances of each country, that generation age as well as possible. Because if they don't, then they've got the aging society problem. But you don't deal with an aging society problem by waiting for everyone to get old. And I think that's, again, where this difference of the longevity perspective came in. Lots happening in this space. Linda talked about the Global Challenge, National Academy of Medicine. You know, what's interesting about this whole area is kind of sort of everyone's sort of startup space, lots of collaborations to be done. We're going to work with a number of institutions taking this forward. So watch this space. Thank you very much.